Welcome to this edition of the Molecule Pod by Eurogas. This time we take a closer look at gas and transport and what it means for European efforts to decarbonise right across the transport sector, whether road, maritime and more. We're delighted to be joined by two industry experts on today's pod. Nadège Leclercq is Senior Director of Government Relations and Market Development at Westport Fuel Systems, while Svetlana Bochkova is Senior Policy Advisor right here at Eurogas. Nadège and Svetlana take us through the nuances of a transport sector that's responsible for roughly 1/4 of total greenhouse gas emissions in the EU. We talk about big progress on the electrification front, hard-to-electrify transport such as long-haul vehicles, and innovative ways we can ramp up the replacement of diesel. Finally, we press our guests on the big legislative files of the day. It's a busy time in Brussels and in transport, so we get into the detail of EU legislation in the coming months, and we look at what's next. Thank you so much for joining us, Nadège and Svetlana, for today's Molecule Pod. It's really great to have you.
Thanks for having us, Mathieu. Good to be here.
Listen, first off, maybe Svetlana and then maybe Nadège, could you maybe tell our listeners why we should be paying attention to gas in the transport sector? Why does it matter? And actually, how important is this for Europe's efforts to decarbonise?
Transport is responsible for about 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions in the EU today. And when I say transport, I mean transport of people, transport of goods, and all modes of transport, like aviation or road transport, waterborne, you name it. So those GHG emissions are composed, on one hand, of CO2 emissions that are harmful for the environment. So it's very important to find technologies to remedy that and to regulate in that area. But the other part of greenhouse gases that we hear about maybe a little bit less because they represent a smaller share, actually have a capacity to trap more heat, for instance, nitrous oxide, and they also have harmful health consequences. So it's important to regulate both. And at Eurogas, we look at road and maritime transport in particular, because it's where we think that renewable and low carbon fuels, such as biomethane or hydrogen, can really play a role in decarbonizing the transport sector, but also reducing air pollution, and they can do it fast, which is needed to reply to objectives of the Green Deal, net zero emissions by 2050, but also intermediary targets for 2030.
Brilliant, thanks, Svetlana. And Nadège, what is Westport's take on that? Why is it really important for Westport that we look at gas and transport?
Yeah, thank you, Mathieu, and good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity. So if we look at transport, Svetlana just set it the scene, and if we look at what are the solutions used today and what we are expecting for the future. For several years, there has been a lot of hope on electrification. So how the different electrified vehicle technologies will be decarbonizing the transport sector, and also particularly the heavy-duty vehicle sector. And the reality is that the challenge is huge, as stated by Svetlana. There are battery electric trucks. They have been announced, they're being developed, and some are available. That's coming, that's great. But they will not solve the problem on their own, because most of the CO2 from road transport actually comes from long-haul trucks. And these vehicles are the most challenging to electrify. We can even just take an example of Germany that has put strong hopes on electric trucks with catenary wires, and they have tested that, and the results were below their expectations with some technical, financial drawbacks. Also, the environmental benefits are more limited than expected. So now we see that the German Ministry of Transport is taking a more open approach, including several types of climate-friendly trucks. And to me, this just confirms that the only way to succeed in decarbonizing transport, and more specifically the heavy-duty transport sector, is to rely on a mix of solutions, and that we need to deploy all viable solutions as soon as they're available to replace the 96% of diesel that we still have in the heavy-duty vehicle sector in Europe.
Sure. No, thank you, Nadège. I appreciate that. You've both set the scene very well. And I particularly appreciate the German case study that you've mentioned. I mean, and we'll talk about what's happening in the EU or at the EU level in a minute. But Svetlana, apparently Eurogas has, I suppose, some news on her own remit in terms of gas and transport, because, of course, this podcast begs the question, I mean, why are we talking about it specifically? What's happening in that regard?
Yes, that's right. Transport has been an important topic for Eurogas for several years. Especially since the Green Deal. But we have been working together with NGVA and its members on that topic because for us it's a natural outcome in the end to merge both organizations, to strengthen our expertise and to speak with one voice about gas and transport.
Sure thing, Svetlana. Nadège, how do you think this is going to move transport up the agenda in the gas sector?
Well, first, we've been a member and a board member of NGVA for a number of years, and for us as a company, industry associations are essential to help represent our sector's interest. And as senior vice president of NGVA for 3 years, I've been involved in the various activities of the association, and I believe it's very beneficial to have a stronger collaboration between both associations. And we already see it with the merger of the transport policy related activities. Both associations are well aligned on transport policy positions and also very complementary. So we benefit from each of these expertise, and we're just stronger together to represent gas mobility and cover the variety of topics we have to address.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Nadège. So that's obviously a bit of internal news with it. I think it was quite important we mentioned that. But I have a question for you both on the policy front. So, I mean, here in Brussels, the imperative to drive down emissions means that policymakers are working very hard on a number of fronts. So we've got the Renewable Energy Directive, CO2 standards for heavy-duty vehicles, and so on. But maybe, Svetlana, could you start by giving our listeners a bit of an update on these files? Why is everyone so busy in Brussels right now?
Yes, thanks. It will be difficult to give an update about everything, but I will try to mention a few of them.
Yeah, just the most important ones,
So you mentioned the Renewable Energy Directive, and it's actually part of that Fit for 55 package to reach our climate objectives that are nearer to us in the future. And the RED is going to be completed after this summer, and it gives basically EU targets for renewable energy sources in our energy consumption in the EU. So that's very important, a piece of legislation. But we also have other policies that are not in the Fit for 55, such as Repower EU plan, which is actually a consequence of Russian invasion in Ukraine. And they believe that we need to reinforce security of supply. And to do that, we can produce renewable energy sources like biomethane or hydrogen internally. That's also a very important side of the coin, I would say, the supply side for all those renewable energy sources. And then on the demand side, in the sector of transport, it's important to regulate the infrastructure that is there for those new alternative fuels, be it electricity or hydrogen or biomethane in transport. They call it in the alternative fuel infrastructure regulation liquefied methane, but it means LNG, bio-LNG, synthetic fuels.
Sure, yeah.
So we need to develop that. And then we have other more sector-specific regulations like FuelEU Maritime that sets a target of reducing GHG emissions by 80% by 2050 in the maritime sector.
Okay.
And that means that we can use also blends of LNG or bio-LNG or hydrogen or other kinds of fuels. But it takes time because this sector is more difficult to electrify. And also when you order a ship, that ship is going to be used for about 40 years.
Right.
So the decisions that you take today are going to influence our GHG emissions for the longer term.
Sure.
Then we have the road transport issues, but maybe I can let Nadège come back to that.
Yeah, Nadège, what about the road transport issue? It's just, are you and Westport must be keeping a really close eye on what's happening here in Brussels in that regard.
Yeah, indeed. And so Svetlana gave already a quite broad overview. Just on the files that Svetlana just mentioned, I would just say that important agreements have been reached in the last few months already. For example, on AFIR and on RED, even if negotiations are still, the final negotiations are still ongoing. So on the refueling infrastructure, there are new requirements, notably for hydrogen. With the renewable energy directive, there will be more renewable energy. And also we see that bio-LNG, so liquefied biomethane, is one of the ways that fuel suppliers can use and actually use to reach their RED targets, even though there are no mandatory targets for biomethane. So these are very positive developments. But really, the key transport files that are still at the core of the agenda for the coming months for us are the CO2 standards for heavy-duty vehicles and Euro 7.
Yeah, Euro 7. And what do you mean by that, Euro 7? It's a strange name, Nadège. What is that?
So Euro 7 is the regulation of emission standards for vehicles. Mm-hmm. So that's what mandates the emission limits for all the new vehicles that are put on the market. We have Euro 6 today, and the proposal from the Commission is to move to Euro 7 in 2025 for light-duty vehicles and 2027 for heavy-duty vehicles, with more stringent emission limits than for Euro 6 vehicles. And also, it's not just about the limits themselves. These limits must also be seen in a broader context, because there are also extended test conditions. There are things that are getting technical about conformity factors, extended durability and lifetime requirements, and also continuous monitoring of the real emissions of the vehicles in the real life. So with all that, you actually end up with really more stringent limits that are proposed with Euro 7 compared to Euro 6 to make all the new vehicles on the road always cleaner.
Right, okay. And that's the crux of it, to make the vehicles on the road cleaner. No, thank you, Nadège. Just on these various files, are there any areas, not of concern, but you think where there might be more optimal solutions to be found in terms of EU legislation? Do you have your eye on anything in particular where you'd like to see a slightly more optimal outcome?
Yes, well, I can start. I'm sure Svetlana will have more thoughts on that. For us, on Euro 7, one aspect is that we recommend to reconsider the CH4 limits, so the methane emission limits for heavy-duty vehicles, because that would improve the overall greenhouse gas emissions. Mm-hmm. There's an aspect also about how quickly we move to the final decision, because it's critical to be able to maintain the implementation timelines that are proposed. And there is an important aspect about alignment between the heavy-duty CO2 standards and Euro 7 policies. Mm-hmm. And they could be better aligned to reach a combined objective. Then on the CO2 standards for heavy-duty vehicles, for us, there are two crucial aspects.
Yeah.
One is the recognition of the role of renewable and synthetic fuels, with the inclusion of a mechanism to cover them. And Svetlana can talk more about that maybe. And the other one is that we support the Commission's proposal for zero-emission vehicles, so the ZEV definition at 5 grams CO2 per ton kilometer. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Because that enables a range of near-zero carbon hydrogen vehicle solutions to be available without enabling vehicles that can run on diesel. And there's a proposal by some political groups to put a 1 gram of CO2 per ton kilometer cap for ZEV, right. But that would actually prevent pilot ignited hydrogen engine technologies to achieve the ZEV label. So we see it as a risk of keeping diesel trucks longer on our roads.
Sure. No, thank you, Nadège. No, listen, that's very clear. Svetlana, do you have any thoughts? Are you seeing anything coming out in Brussels right now that you're thinking, right, we could make this a bit better?
Yes, Mathieu, and I agree with what Nadège already mentioned. For the CO2 standards for trucks, I would say, or heavy-duty vehicles, that it's important that we include all the technologies that can play a role in fast and efficient decarbonization of that sector, meaning also renewable and low-carbon fuels. But I would say, like, in a broader sense, in all those transport policies, there are two things that are really important for us is to ensure consistency between the different files.
Right.
For instance, Fuel EU that regulates maritime sector looks not only at exhaust emission of ships, but also at how the fuels they use are produced, how they are transported, how they are distributed. And we would like to see something similar in the regulation for road transport, because it's more accurate to look at greenhouse gas emission on a broader scope.
Okay, yep.
And the second thing that's really important for us in transport files, but also broader, is technology neutrality. We know that electrification is going to play an important role in decarbonizing transport, gains of efficiency as well. But there are other things like renewable and low carbon fuels that can play a role. So that's a very important point.
Sure thing. No, brilliant. Thank you, Svetlana. Once again, that's very clear. I think, but that's very much on the policy front. That's what's happening here in Brussels. But maybe if we move a little bit beyond EU policy into some more global market and some technology trends, and you touched upon this very briefly, Svetlana, and Nadège as well. How are biomethane and hydrogen actually affecting what we do here and how we do it? Nadège, how does Westport see this, the role of biomethane and hydrogen? And perhaps you've got some other trends and technologies in mind.
Yeah, well, maybe we start with biomethane first. And as we said at the beginning, overall, the transport sector, and particularly the heavy-duty vehicle sector, essentially uses diesel today. We have 96% of diesel with some biodiesel. And next to that, we have a little bit of gas, and then a tiny bit of electricity, and hydrogen that is still negligible. So we have a long way to go to replace all the diesel we are using today by renewable energy. And the good thing is there are already some viable solutions, and biomethane is one of them. And actually there is already market demand for biomethane in transport, and there are a number of signals that are suggesting it's not going to stop here. I can give you a few examples. Gasrec, the UK's leading supplier of gas to the road transport sector, reported recently the highest demand for biomethane in the company's history, and said it's set to continue rising. In Germany, there is a bio-LNG plant from Envitec that has just been completed, that will start operation, and that will produce bio-LNG for about 500 heavy-duty trucks. And Shell is building a large bio-LNG plant in Germany as well that will supply 4,000 to 5,000 trucks. So these are just some examples, but you see there's a lot going on.
Yeah, for sure. And what about, you said that hydrogen at the moment is fairly negligible, but how do you see that market changing in the future? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we do. And actually we do work on that, even though there's this clear trend towards electrification in the sector, and there are also developments of hydrogen fuel cell technologies. These are very important developments that will definitely change the future of the sector. But we also see that another hydrogen solution will be important, and we are convinced that the most cost-effective approach to decarbonizing this sector will also include a central role for internal combustion engines. So that will be engines fueled by renewable fuels like biomethane or hydrogen. And these hydrogen-powered vehicles don't use a fuel cell, as you often hear about, but an engine very similar to today's diesel or biomethane-powered vehicles, except that it's burning hydrogen and emitting virtually no CO2.
Right, I see. So, there is very much, I suppose, a role for hydrogen technologies in the future. But at the moment, the message is loud and clear that biomethane is certainly going to be a very important part of this picture moving forward. Nadège, do you think the EU is ready to embrace what's coming up in terms of new technologies and market trends? Do you think we're ready for this?
Well, definitely, as we discussed in terms of European policy, there are some important developments going on. But we also see that there are, as I said, there are some gaps or some missing aspects in the policies that are currently on the table. So, for example, on one hand, we have Repower EU that Svetlana mentioned, targeting a strong increase in biomethane production, but there are no binding targets associated to that. There's infrastructure, there are vehicles available, but the vehicle manufacturers also need to have clear policy signals that they still have, that these vehicles, for especially biomethane vehicles, still have a future in their portfolio. Otherwise, they will just, at some point, they will abandon their gas vehicle and their biomethane vehicle models. So that's the heavy-duty CO2 standards. That's also some elements of Euro 7 that are important to give these signals. Plus, there are others we haven't discussed. There's the weight and dimension directive that needs to give the same conditions, for example, for all hydrogen-powered vehicles. We also have the taxonomy regulation that establishes a framework to facilitate sustainable investment. And it does recognize biomethane production, but it does not recognize its use as a transport fuel. Sure. So you see, there are clearly some gaps.
Yeah, very much so. Thank you, Nadège. And I suppose that leads me on to my final question to Svetlana. Svetlana, very, very busy times in terms of the legislative calendar. But what's coming up in Brussels in the next few weeks? What's coming up in September, October, November 2023?
What's coming up? I'd say, to rebound on what Nadège said, it's important for European institutions to strike a balance between affordability in the regulations that they propose and sustainability and security of supply. Mm-hmm. And all of that in the run to the next European elections that are going to take place mid-2024. So before that, we already have some changes. Yep. In the EU political arena. We have the European VP Commissioner Frans Timmermans that resigned, and that was leading the Green Deal. So a lot of changes on that political scene, but until then, the Spanish presidency of the Council and the Belgian presidency of the Council want to close a lot of the Fit for 55, which means gas package, but also transport regulations like the CO2 standards that we discussed. There will be important votes in the months to come. And it's important to reach a trialogue phase before the next elections. Otherwise, you have to start the process from scratch.
Indeed, yeah.
And there have been some proposals like weights and dimensions that Nadège mentioned, which are part of a bigger package, greening freight package. So it's important for transport of goods in the Union that were proposed in the summer. So it's really a timely matter to be able to close all of that before the elections.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've definitely got one eye on the European elections coming up. next year. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today on the Molecule Pod. Nadège, thank you very much for your insightful analysis, and likewise for Svetlana. Obviously, I think there's a lot more to follow up on in the coming months, and stay tuned for more news from Eurogas to hear it.
Thank you, Mathieu, and thank you, Svetlana.
Thanks for listening to this edition of the Molecule Pod. You can catch all our episodes on Spotify, Google Podcasts and YouTube, and you can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.